I told people I went for the lights. The gala had a way of pulling you toward banality. Crystal chandeliers, mirrored ceilings, the practiced laughter you learned to wear as if it were couture. The truth was less flattering and much simpler. I went because that night being seen felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with glamour. Rain came down like a secret, hard, sudden, a curtain that turned the boulevard into a smear of neon and tire spray. I left the ballroom early, crown of ice in my hair, palms damp inside my clutch. The photographers were easing into their routines. The social pages, which could be merciful in a lull, would make their calculus at dawn. I had callers, threats thin as fog, and a list of names I couldn't let be dragged into their shadows. I told myself I could manage it. I told myself I would sleep in my own bed, and that everyone was, at some point, theatrical. He was under an umbrella like a secret at the curb, tall, hunched against the rain with the casual arrogance of someone who thought weather was merely a courtesy. His face was a map of small scars, a life that had learned its lines early. He held his hand out, not with the showmanship of a stranger, but with the economy of someone offering exactly what he had to give, protection for a measure of time. His voice, when he spoke, had been made of gravel and something cool and precise, like glass ground to a point. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said. No preamble, no name. It was, perhaps, the only civilized sentence he offered. I could have walked past. I could have stood there, ankles kissed by rain, and measured my options. Call my lawyer, call my security detail, call the man I had paid to smile at my side in photos. But the calculus had been resolute for months. The watchers, the ones who lingered at my doorstep and rewired my reflection into gossip, carried a kind of patience I did not possess. They wore patience like armor. I had worn it badly. Instead, I tilted my chin and said, "Why?" He shrugged, a movement that suggested he had assembled an answer in parts. "Because someone is making you visible in ways you didn't ask for, because I can make you invisible for a while." There was a bargain in that sentence, a kind of blunt offer most people would have flinched at. He proposed a week, 7 days, not a vague promise of endless protection, not the ownership implied by permanent measures. 1 week. It sounded almost modest, like a temporal truce. To accept help, even help that glimmered with danger, is to admit vulnerability. That is a humiliating admission for anyone who has made a life of controlling how they are seen. I was, by training and temperament, a curator of my own image. Yet there was a new terror to being curated by others, the thought of being rearranged as a story. He sensed it. "No strings," he said, the first of the conditions. "You leave when you want, you set the rules." Language like that reassured a small, stubborn part of me. It felt like the only possible currency in situations where power could masquerade as protection. I wanted to believe he meant it, but I have never been who I seemed to be, and I have always judged offers by their fine print. "What do you want in return?" I asked. It was practical and cold, and he let the question sit. He named nothing that would fit on a ledger. He offered instead a key, small and dull, its metal a little warm from being pressed in his palm. He told me the key opened a place where I could be where I needed to be, away from the cameras and the columns of opinion. He said his name then, Dante Moretti, the syllables like a coin dropped into a fountain. He told me, too, that he was asking for 1 week because nothing else was honest. The scale of the help would not, he said, be indefinite, and so there would be no expectation beyond the week. I held the key between 2 fingers, and for a ridiculous moment imagined it as a tiny anchor. Metals anchor things. Agreements, I thought, anchored people. The key felt like both. The rain cut a steady rhythm against the umbrella's fabric.
Taxi lights stared through the mist like indecisive stars. I watched Dante's profile and the way he kept his eyes away from mine, as if to measure me, to see if I would choose to trust his offer or the brittle armor of my own solitude. Choosing to accept would be negotiable only up to the line I set. Choosing to refuse would mean continuing the long, careful choreography of appearing unscathed in the face of those who wanted to make a spectacle of me. I breathed and let the word out. 1 week. He nodded. No celebration, no flourish. He simply extended a hand, palm open, and I placed my own hand into it. It was a clean transaction. We both knew the arithmetic of it. He had given me time, I had given him consent. If you like morally tangled stories, keep listening for what 1 week really bought. He drove me in silence. The car smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. He did not ask about the details of my life or prod gently into the lists of threats I had recited for friends in a room made of faux comforts. He did not claim to be an answer to the things that had followed me. He had instead the kind of confidence that resembled certainty. The house was far from the city's polished edges. It sat on a grade that gave it a modest posture against the weather, its windows sheltered by broad eaves. A high stone wall hid the rest of its secrets. When we stepped out of the car, the rain sloped off in a clean sheet, and I understood in an almost absurdly dynastic way that the difference between a life in the public eye and a life that has been made private was often a single gate. Rosa met us at the broad entrance, like the aftertaste of something sweet, a woman whose movements had been carved by years and steady practice. She smelled of lemon oil and old linen. Her face was soft with an insistence that looked like kindness and a program of unfashionable patience. "You must be Maya," she said, taking my coat with the familiarity of someone who had lived long enough to know how to receive an anxious guest. Her hands were sure. They moved in the way of people who have learned to make order out of mess. Marco stood a little behind her, an outline of watchfulness. He was not large by any dramatic standard, but his sense of presence was exact. He greeted me with a nod rather than a smile. He did not speak unless spoken to, and when he spoke it was to fill a quiet rather than to perform. There was something quietly humane in it. He looked like someone who had been chosen for the edges of things. Inside, the house was not ornate. It was curated. The distinction had little to do with money and everything to do with restraint. The palette of the rooms was neutral, well lit but not theatrical. There were books whose spines had been softened by handling. A greenhouse attached to the service wing let in a green, humid light that smelled like soil and patience. It felt, in that moment, like stepping into a room no one was trying to make a photograph of. We walked through a corridor and into a study where the first truth of Dante's operation presented itself in a quiet flood. A bank of monitors, screens tame as stars, each holding a small, devoted scene. Not all of them were live. Some showed empty streets in grainy night, undramatic. One showed the corner of a reception room where my own gala had been held, an image that made the skin at the base of my neck tighten because it was no one's idea of private. The apparatus of watching could be obscene in its ordinariness. It was one thing to be aware of being seen. It was another to watch one's own image flicker on a stranger's wall. "I asked to see these," I said, not accusing, but laying down the fact in a way that felt like a test. Dante watched me. There was a tiredness behind his eyes I did not know how to read. "You asked me not to be sanctimonious," he said. "You set terms. You wanted transparency." "I want rules," I said. I was careful to say it like a ledger entry. "I want to know what is watched. I want consent. You do not watch me like I am an exhibit." He nodded. "There are rules." Those 2 words should have been the end of the matter, but rules can be elastic, and I had seen that elasticity twist into ownership before. I wanted specifics. Write them down. Give me language that binds you. Tell me what you will and will not do. Rosa made tea while Dante collected his thoughts. Marco watched the door, then the hallway, as if the house could be pried open by patience alone. The kettle hissed in the background while Dante set the terms as if they were small stones on the table. No observation without consent, he said. No entry to places you haven't agreed to. You may leave at any time, and we will escort you if you want. We do not reveal sources.
The promises sounded like the outlines of laws, nice on paper. I pressed, "How do I verify this? How will I know if you break it?" He paused, which was his habit when he was reaching for a truth. "You will have access to all footage involving you," he said. "An independent archivist will maintain a copy for you. We'll set windows, times where access can be requested and reviewed. We will mark anything that concerns potential criminal activity and hand it over to the appropriate authorities where necessary." I had expected either defensiveness or an evasive charm. Instead, I found negotiation. It was the most human thing I could have asked for, to be treated as a party to a contract rather than a ward under watch. The terms were specific enough to be enforceable in a practical sense, and ambiguous enough to leave room for interpretation, exactly why I insisted on an independent archivist. I knew enough of good intentions and their ways of contorting in the dark. "You will not have the right to watch my private conversations with my attorney," I said. It felt petty and necessary to say it out loud. "Agreed," he said it, plainly. He wrote little notes on a pad, a pen that surprised me by having a blunt, almost bureaucratic efficiency. "And what about calligraphhy?" I asked. The name tasted like a threat. The group had been whispered about in a dozen places I would rather not unspool. Whoever they were, a network, an industry, a syndicate of image traders, their name had been hawked across gossip forums, offered as explanation for leaks that smelled of industrial vengeance. His face tightened. "They will know," he said, "but knowledge does not have to mean surrender." "I cannot start wars on my behalf," I said. It was more an ethical guideline than a legal one. You cannot call down extrajudicial justice. "Nor will I," Dante said, "not without you asking, and not without oversight. It's why the week matters. It's limited. It's not a blank check." I watched him write. He made deliberate strokes, as if the act of writing the rules tethered them into something harder than air. Rosa set 2 cups on the table. Marco leaned in the doorway, a sentinel who did not perform his role. Rosa looked at me like someone weighing a recipe and deciding whether to add more salt. "Rules on paper don't stop heartbeats," she said. "Make them you." There was a tenderness in her tone that unfurled something like relief inside me. Rosa's hands had the small authority of someone who had rearranged countless households and observed the domestic negotiations that quietly determined who had power and who had autonomy. She was the kind of woman who measured things in increments of survival. Dante told a story then, not a long one, but enough to make his past a shadow with edges. "My mother died when I was young," he said, not as an excuse, but as a cause. Not only because a wrong was done to her, but because no one paid the sum of attention that would have saved her. I learned to fill absences. It was confession and context at once. There was a wounding in the words, and also an admission of a world he had moved through, one in which taking matters into your own hands was not a moral indulgence, but a method born of grief. His hands, when he said it, did not tremble. He had learned endurance. "You turn those things into solutions that are not always lawful," I said. I asked the question as if it were a scalpel. "Yes,"
He said the word like a contraction. "I did things that I regret. I am not proud of them. That is why I asked the district attorney to review my records if need be. If something has to be turned over, it will be." He met my eyes. If there was an attempt to absolve himself in the offering, it was small and immediately undermined by the weight of the admission itself. This, too, was part of the bargain. He would not be allowed to romance his misdeeds into heroism. "You will not be above consequences," I said, setting another condition. "Whatever you have done, whatever you might do to keep me safe, there must be accountability." He nodded, agreed. Marco, who had not yet spoken, cleared his throat. "I've seen men want to fix things with their hands," he said. His voice was low, the accent worn smooth by neutrality. "It does not always end well. Fixing is different from owning." "You are not here to own," I said. The sentence felt like a hinge between being protected and being possessed. It was a line I had drawn not out of romanticism, but for self-preservation. We continued until the light changed. The negotiation was not a single scene, but a string of small clarifications. When I could review footage, the presence of an independent archivist who would duplicate files for me, a letter of transparency to be drafted by my counsel, the condition that Marco and Rosa were not instruments, but people whose care would have dignity. We talked about the buttons we refused, no monitoring of my attorney, no deliberate provocation of contacts, no sharing of my private movements with third parties outside the circle we had authorized. Dante agreed to a schedule of review, a cadence of reporting that would satisfy a certain bureaucratic appetite for order. He acknowledged his debts. He said he was preparing to face them in court if necessary. At some point, he handed me the key again. He did it without ceremony, a small, weightless gesture like returning a borrowed book. He said, "You won't need to use it, but it's yours." I turned the key in my fingers and felt the cool metal be oddly palatable, an anchor for a decision without yet knowing its cost. The key was not a trophy, it was a compact. I placed it in my purse, not as a sign of ownership, but as a token of my consent to the week. I would leave when I wanted. That was the clause that mattered most. The first night was simple.
Rosa made soup that tasted like sunlight, clear and precise. Marco cleared a corner near the study where my things sat like a puzzled baggage of public life, an overnight bag, a pair of shoes that whispered of liminal spaces, and a book I would not open. There was a small ritual to breakfast. The greenhouse next to the kitchen sent in a quiet chlorophyll light that made the room seem as if it had been painted with thoughtfulness. There were other small intimacies that, in a different narrative, might have been used to invite melodrama. Marco folding my napkin with a soldier's care, Rosa brushing the corner of a photograph with the tenderness of a priest. Dante poured tea like a man who would learn to be gentle in the everyday. He did not overcompensate with grand gestures. Instead, he practiced a repertory of small, solid acts, clearing plates, reading a legal memo when it was his turn to listen, asking if the light was too bright, if the curtains made me anxious. We talked when I could bear it. He told me about his mother in more detail, the ritual of her gardening, the books she read aloud at dusk, the small inconsistencies that made her death not only tragic, but brimming with the possibility of being prevented. I did not pity him. I understood his grief as a motive rather than an exculpation. His voice softened when he told these things. It was not a plea, it was context. At times, he would cross a line. That was inevitable in a house where power was professional tradecraft. Once, late and a little breathless after a report of a probe near my city building, he dipped into a channel of footage without asking. He did not mean to be cruel. His hands moved with the old reflexes, he admitted. His eyes sought surveillance by habit. I saw it happen. The muscles in his neck tighten, the hand reach for a dial. The movement was small, like a tremor. "You promised," I said, the words clipped.
He looked up as if someone had tapped him on the shoulder in a theater. For a moment his face had that rawness where regret and need intersected. He shut the monitor down with a practiced economy that suggested avoidance was a muscle he had stretched and shortened repeatedly in his life. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't think." "That's not enough," I replied. It was the only way to name a line. He accepted the rebuke, which in itself was a kind of repair. He apologized again, smaller, with the embarrassed humility of someone caught in the small commerce of flawed affection. I am not entirely convinced apologies are moral currency, but they are a place to start. He promised steps, better locks on his own reflexes, a protocol to be followed when footage was requested. He asked if I would trust him to do the work. Trust is not a garment you try on and remove. It is a muscle that must be exercised and tested. The week was meant to be a period of exercise.
Days passed with a strange domesticity. Tea at dawn, legal briefings at noon, a walk in the estate's small orchard at dusk, where Dante sometimes spoke in half lines about his work, sidelong confessions into the dark. Marco would take my calls when necessary, his voice made of a neutrality that reminded me of the good people who carried burdens without ceremony. Rosa would seat me near the kitchen stove and speak about smallings, how to mend a tear in tissue, how to keep a house from becoming a theater for sorrow. There were moments of lightness, too. Dante could laugh, a rare, almost transparent sound that seemed to surprise him. He would point out a new shoot in the greenhouse, a small, tender thing that suggested life continued despite our best plans. It made him human in the way the mundane does, by refusing to be heroic. But the watchers do not wait politely. On the fourth night, after a long, small argument about the line between vigilance and violation, the system that had been dormant stirred in a way that suggested we were being watched in return. A camera near the property's outer gate reported static, then a brief shadow crossing the frame. The monitor pulsed, not because of a distant threat, but because the world outside had an appetite. Dante saw it first, and the way he moved then was swift, efficient, the old reflexes sharpening around a core that had been trained on harm. Marco followed, clean and precise. Rosa, who had never been less than organized, stood in the doorway with a white towel around her shoulders and her eyes like a question. "Call the city patrol," Dante said. It was an instruction, but there was a tremor in his voice that gave it the shape of worry. I watched them move as if in a choreography I had only recently learned the steps to. They did not perform for me. They performed because something had been punctured, and the response required attention. In the absence of cinematic violence, there was a quieter, more precise danger, a violation of the sense of safety they had created. The idea that someone could approach the wall and disappear as if the property were a fragile membrane made even the greenhouse seem susceptible to bite. We found scuff marks near the gate, small, plausible, not the jagged aftermath of a dramatic assault, but enough to be evidence that we were being tested. Someone wanted to know how we would respond. Someone was probing the boundary between watchfulness and intrusion. "It's a probe," Marco said, voice flat, "testing reaction times." Dante's jaw set in a manner that suggested an old, ugly readiness. He wanted to answer with the sort of completeness that would erase the taste of the attack. I wanted to force the answer into the shape we had made for ourselves, measured, accountable, and above all, legal. I had seen through the gloss of protective violence and recognized how quickly it could become a method of owning another person in the name of safety. "We call the patrol," I said.
We document everything. We do not retaliate. He looked at me then with a kind of respect that felt like raw currency. "You set the terms," he said. "I will follow them." There was an elegance in that moment, an almost ceremonial playing out of the rules we had shaped.
It would be tempting to say that the probe was repelled by our will. That would romanticize a small, serious thing. The patrol arrived and made notes. The city asked its procedural questions in a tone designed to be neutral. The officers were efficient and not particularly interested in the larger moral arithmetic of our lives. Still, the probe had the effect it wanted. It had introduced a new variable, the knowledge that boundaries could be tested, and the knowledge that someone would test them again. I found myself both steadier and more unstable for the realization. The week that had felt like a bounded experiment now stretched its edges into something less definite. We agreed to add a clause. Any probing that suggested organized interference would be documented and turned over. If anyone used this week as justification for unauthorized action, there would be consequences. Dante placed his hand over his heart as if to swear, which was not how oaths were done, but felt like a human gesture nonetheless. Night settled unevenly after the incident. The house seemed to breathe around us, its rooms filled with a quiet that was not comfort so much as the hush of a percussive thing about to be measured. I lay awake for a long while, feeling the weight of the key in my bag, and thinking of how intangible our contracts often are. Trust, consent, the right to leave. These were not absolutes given by a man under an umbrella. They were promises I had to hold in my hands and test. When sleep finally found me, it was the sort of patched rest earned in small increments. The week continued. Negotiations remained active, not merely in legal addendums, but in the language we used at breakfast, and in the small corrections made when a reflex went too far. Each apology had to be accompanied by a plan for not repeating the same movement. Each surveillance request had to be filed, reviewed, and published to the independent archivist's ledger. The rituals were bureaucratic but humane, and for someone who had spent a life curating surfaces, the hum of paper and the firmness of signatures offered a crude comfort. And then, on the sixth night, something occurred that changed the arithmetic of the week in a way I had not expected. It was not dramatic in a way that would suit headlines. There was no car explosion, no cinematic capture. Instead, there was the sound of glass, a single pane, high up, somewhere in the house's east wing. It was the brittle, precise noise of a window being tested. The sound woke me with that animal immediacy that makes the body ready before the mind arrives. I dressed without thinking, fingers practiced. Marco was at the doorway already, his face a study in composed alarm. Dante followed, calmer than I felt, his coat a dark presence that rearranged the light. We moved as a unit down a corridor that smelled faintly of lemon and the greenhouse's green light. The monitor bank showed nothing unusual at first, a blank feed here, a student of static there. But then a camera shimmered and for a moment showed the reflection of someone bending away from the glass like a shadow retreating. He was not a silhouette. The image was a man close enough that his breath fogged the pane. The footage cut, not maliciously, but as if someone had removed a page from a book. "We're being pushed," Marco said. "No," Dante corrected, his expression sharpening. "We're being read." Those are not the same things. One implies force, the other implies scrutiny. The distinction mattered because it told me whether we were in danger of a wound or in danger of being made into gossip again. "Who could do this?" I asked, though I knew the answer to the question. Calibracy did not always operate with the blunt force of criminals. They were often patient, corrosive, an industry of attention that traded in the slow erosion of privacy. They were the kind of entity that learned to make reputation into currency and then launder it into leverage. Dante's face hardened in a way that suggested a memory of violence and of having been compelled to respond without authority. There was a plan that went beyond the simple mechanics of deterrence. There would be a call to the DA, an archivist review, and if the evidence suggested a pattern, a public record. The house had held its promises up to now, but there is a cost to turning shadows outward. I thought, briefly, of the key in my bag and the ways in which it could be read.
To some, it might be a token of the week, an accessory that made a photo op more intimate. To others, to those who lurk and consume, a key could be the emblem of being owned. I slid the key in my fingers, feeling the cold metal, and the action felt less symbolic than an exertion of will. It was mine. It had been offered to me. The decision to keep it was not made from desire for romance. It was made from the practical arithmetic of consent. Dante watched me with a look I could not parse, something like relief and something like calculation. Marca watched the doorway. Rosa stood behind us in the kitchen, her face a map of lines that meant she had seen more than I had the luxury to imagine. "Tomorrow," Dante said, quiet and exact. "We go to the DA, we hand over footage, we make this a record." I nodded. That night, as the house moved into the hush after the small alarm, I lay awake with the rain in the gutters and the residual sense that our week had not been a reprieve, but a test. It had been a way to see how we would behave when exposed, and the knowledge that someone else was drawing lines around me felt less comforting than it had at the curb.
The difference between being watched and being safe, I learned that night, is not only in the volume of the cameras, but in who controls the ledger. I had asked for a week to breathe, to see whether I could live with someone else in the architecture of protection. Instead, I found a kind of negotiation that would not end in 7 days, because the world beyond us had its own appetite. In the grey morning hours, I took the key from my bag and set it on the bedside table. It gleamed small and unassuming, and it reminded me of how fragile decisions can be, hot for a moment in the hand, then cool and ready to be tested again. The DA's office was a glass box of measured blandness. It smelled of lemon cleaner and paper, the kind of clarity that wants to feel like justice, but sometimes arrives as a series of forms. Dante had insisted I come with him. He drove with a restraint that felt practiced, as if he had learned to turn fierceness into something quieter when the world required bureaucratic patience. Marco sat in the back, hands folded, his profile a steady calm. Rosa had insisted on staying at the house. She folded the hem of my coat with an accuracy that read like a benediction, then kissed my forehead as if to anchor me to something simple and human. The intake took longer than I expected. A young assistant with precise braids asked me questions that were clinical and necessary, names of platforms, timestamps, the tone of the threats. I answered as one does in a deposition, factual, cataloguing fear the way one records in inventory. I kept returning to the moments that had felt like friction points, instances where the watchers had turned an intrusion into a narrative about me. Those were the things I wanted the DA to understand, that the injury was not only to my privacy, but to my agency. Dante did not speak much during the intake. He had brought a hard drive with him and a note from the independent archivist who had begun cataloguing footage. The archivist's work felt like a talisman, duplicates made, timestamps verified, a neutral ledger that might in time prove the factual arcs behind claims of intrusion. The DA's deputy listened with a professional skepticism that kept conversions in the realm of paper and precedent. There are miles of law between being watched and having the law bend on your behalf, and the DA's office spoke the language of those miles. "You understand the exposure that might come with this?" the deputy asked Dante finally. His eyes flicked to me first, then back to Dante. "In handing this over, you make evidence public in ways that could affect third parties." Dante looked at me and then at the deputy. "We understand," he said. "We want accountability." The DA's office opened an inquiry. It was not instant heroism. It was a slow mechanism that chewed on the facts and spat out subpoenas. Calibration, like a weather front, did not declare itself in a way that could be hit with an immediate legal response. They left traces, shell accounts, intermediaries, laundering by attention.
The DA's team moved through the channels with procedural care, asking for what they could prove: identity transfers, IP addresses that led to service providers, indirect payments. Dante provided everything he had: footage, notes, the ledger prepared by the archivist. He chose exposure as a method of accountability. He stepped into the light knowing the cost. When the first press release arrived, short, legal, carefully worded, my phone exploded with messages. The press is a beast that reads restraint as a gap to be filled. The social feeds, which had once been patient in the lull after the gala, now began to assemble their calculus at noon. Headlines used verbs like alleged, which is the language of law, and shocking, which is the language of commerce. The initial coverage favored salaciousness, as newspapers often do, trimming legal nuance into intrigue. A journalist named Lena called. I had met her once in a room of other people who liked to map reputations. She had a voice like someone balancing a question on a finely sharpened stick, curious but careful enough to avoid assuming cruelty. She asked for comment, not for the performance of crisis management, but for the nuance of a human story. She wanted to know what it felt like to have boundaries tested, what it meant to accept help from someone like Dante, and then ask them to be accountable. Her questions were not prurient, they wanted architecture. I agreed to speak with Lena only on the condition she hear Dante's intent as well as my fear. We met in a neutral cafe where the light fell like consent. I remember how the steam from my tea made a small fog on the table, and how Dante watched me with a patience that did not pretend at innocence. Lena listened, and when she wrote her first piece, it did not feed on the melodrama. It parsed choices. It named calibracy as an industry of attention, not an amorphous villain. It used words like privacy laundering and weaponized visibility. Readers commented in droves. Some were kind, some were cruel, and some were plain curious about how one becomes visible in ways one does not choose. Calibracy responded as calibracy does, with a rustle of distortion. First, there were denials, pushed to outlets that trafficked in rumor, anonymous alt accounts that hinted at impropriety, and an op-ed that suggested that social value is a public good to be redistributed. The company, or the network, did not show itself in a single body, but through intermediaries who flashed like small, sharp things. The objective was not to convict Dante in a court of law, but to make the air around him feel toxic. Then the road ambush happened. It was the kind of assault that begins as speed and ends as an appetite for panic. Marco had insisted on accompanying me to a meeting across the river. Dante had stayed at the house to manage the flow of footage and calls. We were in the car when it happened. An ordinary black sedan, and then another vehicle that forced us to slow. There was a flash of metal, the smell of burned rubber, the chirp of a horn, and the precise dislocation of something that overturns the ordinary. The attack was sudden, mechanical, enough force to shift our seats, to make the world reorder into a different grammar. Someone tried to wrench the door open. Marco's voice, low and steady, became an instrument of clear instruction. There were shouts. I remembered the metallic tang of the hazard lights. The car behind us slowed as emergency vehicles approached, and in that small window we realized we had been the target of something more than a random road rage. We were not physically harmed beyond bruises and rattled nerves. The car had a dent that would be fodder for gossip photographers, but we were alive. The event could have been worse. The reality of that possibility chased me into the night. I lay awake afterwards thinking in spirals about contingency plans and the ways in which my life, my brand, and my freedom had been weaponized. The law responded with its bureaucratic insistence. Police reports, forensics, traffic cams that crawled back through the city's memory like insects sifting through a street. The footage Dante had handed over to the DA fed into that engine, which is the slow and meticulous business of constructing culpability. Calabresi's strategy, once it feels pressure, is to escalate in reputation before it escalates in force. First, undermine the victim. A smear campaign launched with surgical efficiency. Sensitive content, vague, unverified, trickled into less reputable feeds. An influencer with a large following raised questions about my personal life. A tabloid source suggested that I had sought out extreme measures without acknowledging the cost. Our household, our terms, were reframed as something else entirely, an arrangement of dramatic possession. The phones buzzed with unkind things. This is where the triangle hardened. On one corner, the social currents that wanted my image to be a product. On another, the man who had vowed to protect me, whose actions had real human consequences. And on the third, the law, which could offer a structure for accountability, but not an immediate shelter from the storm. I felt myself positioned at the center, not as a passive figure, but as the arbiter of my own choices. I could not be merely the object of others' narratives. If there was to be a triangle, it would be shaped as a negotiation I would enter into, not a trap. Dante made a public statement through the DA's office. He would cooperate fully, he would provide evidence, and he would accept institutional oversight. It was a prepared statement. It cost him. Within weeks, months in the legal sense, his businesses began to fray. Contracts were paused. Partners asked for clarifications. He had not expected immunity from consequence. That was the point of our bargaining.
Exposure would be a way to subject his methods to judgment. The DA's investigation gathered momentum. There were filings, depositions, and the kind of slow unspooling that the law favors. Dante's past actions, interventions he had admitted to in the house, surfaced in a formal context. He was charged with a series of misdemeanors and a couple of felonies that pertained to unauthorized entries and data intercepts. The charges were not presented as moral theater. They were procedural responses to breaches that, on paper, read like violations. He was offered a plea: restitution, a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, community service, and limits imposed on certain business practices that had facilitated past transgressions. He could have fought to the end, but legal battles cost lives in ways money cannot always measure. Dante chose to accept a deal that would make him accountable, that would anchor him in a series of conditions meant to prevent repeat offenses. I sat with the decision as one sits with a verdict to be given to someone you both love and must hold. It was not an absolution. It was consequence. It was also the start of a different ledger, one that required public repair. He lost clients. He lost money. He lost a freedom he had once used to fix things the way he saw fit. I did not feel triumphant. I felt aware of the cost. The people who had stood to profit from his method had closures they would not like. But the fundamental principle I had set from the beginning, that no one would be above consequence, was being realized. In the hearings, I sat in a seat that felt both public and painfully intimate. The courtroom is a space designed to shape narratives into rule-bound language. Dante listened with a concentration I had not seen on him during a crisis. He gave testimony. He described his mother, her garden, and the ways grief had shaped a man who would take the law into his hands rather than wait for its slow march. He did not attempt to dress his actions as heroism. He presented them as faults, choices made in a grief-shattered architecture. I, too, testified. It was strange to tell the story of accepting this week in the cold light of an oath. I described the bargain, the rules we had written, the nights over soup, the key on my bedside table. I described the probe at the gate and the road ambush, not as melodrama, but as evidence of being targeted. The lawyers asked precise questions, and my answers were catalogued in the stenographer's small mechanical scripture. The hearings became a location where private choices became public text. I felt exposed, yes, but not helpless. Testimony is a kind of agency, an articulation of truth into law's ledger. As the legal process turned, the world outside refracted differently.
Lena, the journalist, continued to report with a fidelity to nuance that surprised us both. Her follow-ups sketched the architecture of Calibracy's attention economy and suggested systemic reforms.
A small cohort of columnists began to ask questions about who profits from reputations. There were calls for policy that would increase transparency for data brokers and make clandestine reputation commerce harder to operate in the shadows. These were early tendrils of something larger. They were not rescue, but they were a context in which our story could be framed as a symptom of a broader industry. Dante, to his credit, engaged the consequences with a discipline that looked like penance. He agreed to court-mandated audits and to make a public statement of contrition that was measured, not theatrical. He attended anger management courses offered as part of his probation, community work that involved teaching young men the costs of extrajudicial action, and a reality-sobering schedule of restitution. He accepted the loss of certain channels he had once used for private surveillance and signed contracts that limited his ability to operate without oversight. He also agreed to a public registry of activities related to reputation mitigation, something the DA's office recommended as part of a restorative package. These were not easy concessions. They cut into the reflexes that had become his trade. Simultaneously, we began building the foundation we had sketched in provisional conversations. It was to be a small institution at first, a fund, an advisory board, and a program aimed at people who had been targeted by reputational predators. We wanted it to be run by people who understood surveillance as harm, lawyers, survivors, and technologists who could advocate and offer practical support without becoming an industry of attention themselves. The idea of a board made me nervous. Boards have a way of calcifying idealism into governance, so we insisted the board include independent auditors, legal counsel, and survivors' voices. Rosa would be on staff in an advisory capacity. Marco, who had an unexpected knack for logistics and a tenderness I had come to rely on, took a role in security that was strictly defined by law and by the rules we had set. The foundation was both public repentance and structural repair. Dante funded it in part with the proceeds of assets he sold as part of the restitution. The rest came from donors who were interested in systemic reform rather than spectacle. The Foundation's charter explicitly prohibited the use of surveillance for retaliatory purposes, and an independent archivist, someone with a background in privacy law, was appointed to oversee data handling. The DA's office welcomed the initiative as a tangible demonstration that restitution could take the form of repair rather than simply punishment. For my part, I asked to be considered for a leadership role. I wanted the Foundation to be run by someone who had tasted the damage of being weaponized and chosen, therefore, to work on the architecture of prevention.
Accepting the directorship felt like a way to turn the triangle outward. Rather than choosing between protection and exposure, the Foundation offered a third front that argued systems could be changed. I believed that a person who had been targeted had a kind of responsibility to be part of the making of institutions that might prevent that targeting for others. It was not noble, it was practical. It also felt like the most straightforward ethical extension of the bargaining I had made at the curb. Foundations, like households, are made of small rituals. The first meeting was in a modest conference room with sunlight that felt lukewarm rather than dramatic. Rosa brought scones. Marco took notes like a monk. The advisory board included a privacy lawyer named Harini, who smelled faintly of jasmine and used the phrase data dignity as if it were both policy and prayer. A survivor named Lena, different from the journalist, spoke about the feeling of reputation as a theft and asked for programs that could help people rebuild. Dante sat quietly, often silent, listening in a way that felt less performative than reparative. We drafted programs, emergency legal funds for those in the first days after a leak, a counseling network, lobbying for stronger oversight of reputation brokers, and a certification program for ethical reputation work. There were arguments about the right balance between advocacy and confidentiality. How public should the Foundation be? The board wrestled with transparency as a principle, circumscribed by the need to protect clients who might still be targeted.
It was the work of trying to thread a needle between openness and safety. We created a charter that emphasized survivor leadership and a governance structure meant to minimize the risk of becoming a laundering entity for attention work. The work was steady and mundane in ways that mattered. Grants were written, meetings scheduled. The DA's office continued to consult. A small team of lawyers drew up clear protocols for how evidence should be handled and when it should be handed to law enforcement. We established guidelines for not exacerbating harm and for resisting the temptation to monetize outrage. It was an ethical architecture built from the lessons of our own negotiations. When Dante signed the final documents that formalized the Foundation's funding, he brought me a small box. I recognized the weight before I opened it, the same metallic cadence as the key he had given me the night I accepted his offer. He put the box in my hands without ceremony. Inside was another key, almost identical to the first, but this one attached to a small tag with engraved words: consent, accountability, exit. I held the key and felt the press of weeks and hearings and slow, merciless daylight. The tag's words were not aphorisms, they were conditions. Dante watched me while I read them, his face an architecture of careful, honest lines.
"I wanted you to have it the night you first stayed," he said, "but I thought you should keep the one you chose. This is different." "It's the same metal," I said. It was true. Metal is metal. The meaning comes from the hand that offers it and the hand that accepts. He knelt in a private way, an old habit of humility perhaps, and asked nothing dramatic, only that I keep it if I wanted to. The key in that moment was not a claim, but a covenant. I slid it into the pocket of my coat, not as a surrender, but as a pledge to a set of rules we had made together, and a reminder of the legible conditions that bounded our relationship. Keeping the key did not erase the weeks of hearings or the way the city's tabloids had tried to turn our private negotiations into a romance for consumption. It did, however, feel like an emblem I could touch in moments of doubt, a tiny proof that my consent had been recognized as binding. I did not confuse the gesture with safety. I had read the ledger of consequences carefully. The key was a reminder: consent can be given again and renegotiated. It is not a one-time transfer. The months that followed were not cinematic. They were forms and memos and therapy sessions. I met with a counselor who specialized in trauma induced by public exposure. Her office smelled of cedar and chamomile. She asked me what it felt like to be consumed by attention. "It feels often like being a house with all the doors open," I said, and she nodded as if I had described the weather. Dante attended sessions too, sometimes alone, sometimes with me. He learned that accountability required not only public acts, but private habits, pausing before looking at footage, stepping away from channels that tempted him to act, letting the law do its work rather than improvising. He performed these small tethers with a discipline that suggested a genuine re-education of reflex. Marca returned to his old life in a way that was less spectacular than people imagined. He had once been a military engineer of sorts before taking on work that blurred into protective detail. He had been loyal and quietly humane from the start. After the hearings, he left the security business he had been a part of and accepted a role in the Foundation that kept him close to safety work but brutally limited the capacity for unilateral action. He told me once that what he liked about the Foundation was the scaffolding it required, protocols, audit trails, and the small, unglamorous work of preventing honeyed violence masquerading as protection. Rosa, who had a backstory of her own, had been a housekeeper in another life when a scandal had taken her employer's reputation and made unemployment into a real fear. She had taught herself how to be indispensable, how to organize rooms so that a household's identity remained intact.
She joined the Foundation's outreach, helping people find simple, practical ways to rebuild routines. Her counsel about making small things out of order helped many of the Foundation's clients walk back into a life that did not feel permanently theatrical. Calibracy did not disappear. In fact, they retaliated. A smear campaign took a darker tone, doctored images, selective edits of Dante's history, and, in one mean-spirited instance, an anonymous piece that implied illicit financial dealings. The DA's office subpoenaed records and found the smear to be a composite built from falsehoods and misdirection. The platform hosting the images issued takedowns. We pursued legal remedies where we could and sought to educate the public about the mechanics of reputation laundering where we could not. Calibracy's tactics had become a symptom of a larger marketplace where attention could be bought and sold like a commodity. One evening, as autumn thinned the light and the greenhouse's leaves reached brittly toward the last warmth, I received a letter from a young woman who wrote about how her life had been ruined when a private company sold her intimate emails to a gossip site. She wrote with a combination of fear and courage, asking if there were programs that could help her. I sat at the small table in the kitchen, the letter in my hands, and realized that the Foundation was no longer a political statement for us, but a practical answer to an industry problem. That moment, holding a handwritten note from a stranger whose life had been broken by attention for sale, felt like the point of the months of work, to convert our collision with Calibracy into a platform for repair. Public life crept back in its own rhythms. I took speaking engagements, carefully curated, prefaced with a note that I would not be giving lurid details. I learned to answer questions without providing fodder for gossip. I began to attend smaller events with fewer cameras. The gala season approached again, and with it the old choreography of being a social figure: lights, cameras, curated laughter. People expected a return. I had to decide how to return on my own terms. The night I chose to re-enter the public stage, I did not do it as spectacle. I opted for a modest charity dinner, one of many nights that fold into the season, but often make space for earnest conversations. Lena, the journalist, was there in the audience. So was the DA, who came in an official capacity to support the Foundation's work. Dante arrived late, not as a promissory symbol, but as a man whose presence had been tempered by months of hearings and public consequence. He wore an unassuming suit and a face that had been pared down by the demands of accountability. He stood in the back of the ballroom at first, watching the room as if cataloging the light. The room was full of images that once would have been my currency. I felt the old reflex to perform and resisted it. I walked in with the knowledge that this night could be captured and reframed in ways I might not control. I had made my peace with that.
What I wanted now was less to be seen than to be present on terms I defined. Photographers took pictures of the room as they always do, hungry for composition. A headline did run the next day, but it was different in tone from previous seasons. The piece focused on the Foundation's new initiative and described how survivors' voices would be central to the project. It quoted Lena and the DA. It mentioned Dante's cooperation and the legal consequences he had accepted. The narrative arc was messy in places, but it was recognizable as an attempt to describe repair rather than invention. After the dinner, Dante asked to speak with me alone. We went up to the roof terrace, a private place that looked out over the city like a living map. The air was cold and tasted like metal and clean things. The lights from the ballroom glowed below like a distant constellation. We stood with the city's hum around us and the greenhouse scent clinging to his coat like a memory. "You could have walked away," he said quietly, as if speaking a truth he had not yet owned. "You could have left me to the consequences and taken your life back to the way it was." "I could have," I said,
But leaving would have meant letting the structure that hurt me continue unexamined. It would have meant pretending the week was only about me and not about the architecture that allowed harm. He was silent for a long time. The scent of rain from earlier that week hung in the city air, a faint residue. "I am sorry for the things I did," he said finally. "Not for the protection I offered, that felt right then, but for the lines I crossed. I thought I was being just. I was wrong." "You accepted consequences," I said. "That mattered." "It cost me," he admitted. "It cost everything I used to think made me useful. I have fewer clients. Some people in my old world have turned their backs. I am smaller in the way that matters." Our conversation was not an exchange of absolution and erasure. It was a negotiation of continuing terms. We talked about boundaries again, the ways in which love can be a form of negotiation without being ownership. He promised plainly to keep the rules we had codified: no surveillance without consent, handover of potential criminal cues to law enforcement, and enforced public auditing of the Foundation's activities. I promised to insist on transparency when lines blurred. We spoke about the key in my pocket like people discussing a contract that had both symbolic and practical implications. When he reached for my hand on the terrace, the gesture felt less like the seizure of the man who had once wanted to fix things by force, and more like someone learning to ask again. His thumbs found the small lines of my knuckles as if memorizing a geography. Our lips met in a way that was not the script of all passion and not the remedy for past harms.
It was a covenant, a physical punctuation that said we would continue to negotiate, continue to be accountable to one another and to the public we had both been part of. The kiss was quick and sure, and left an aftertaste not of salvation, but of a compact. We returned to the room and the crowd like people who had agreed upon a private law. I felt the old adrenaline of being in the public eye ebb away and a different steadiness take its place. The triangle I had inhabited, public, protector, law, had not collapsed into a neat geometry. It had been reframed into a quadrilateral of sorts: me, Dante, the law, and the public institutions we were trying to change. The shape was more complex, but had a clearer axis. Consent and accountability had to be the speaking terms. When the tabloids tried to reclaim the narrative with an article that implied I had romanticized violent action, Lena wrote another piece, interviewing survivors and pulling the lens back from the sensations of scandal to the structures that made reputational damage a business. The public's appetite for a tidy romance dimmed in the face of sustained reporting about Calabresi's practices. The company's power waned slowly as platforms enacted stricter verification policies and regulators asked more probing questions. It was not a victory lap. It was a reflection of persistent work that involved lawyers, advocates, and survivors telling their stories in measured, documented ways. On an ordinary morning, months after the first week, Rosa called me into the greenhouse to show me a new shoot. A delicate vine had pushed through a crack and found a way to climb the trellis like someone pressing into possibility. She smiled in a way that read as both motherly and fierce. "You remember when I told you to make the rules your own," she said. "You have done that." I touched the vine's fresh green as if it were a small miracle. Marco walked in, sat on the greenhouse bench, and handed me a packet of documents: the Foundation's new audit, the list of people who had reached out for emergency funds, and an invitation for me to give a talk on a panel about data dignity. The work had accrued small proofs. People helped, policies shifted, and the DA's office had issued recommendations for better oversight of reputation brokers. There was a private moment that came quietly, months before we would decide to return publicly to the ballroom in a more permanent sense.
Dante pulled the first key, the one I had kept on my bedside table, out of his coat pocket. He placed it on the small wooden table between us. He looked at me and asked if I would like to keep it somewhere else, perhaps on a chain, perhaps not at all. He did not ask me to keep it because it meant possession. He asked because he wanted to know my preference. I looked at the key and then at him. "I keep it," I said, "not because it binds me to you, but because it reminds me of the terms we wrote together. The key is a grammar for consent." He nodded, and for a moment the world narrowed to the small motion of our hands and the damp, clean smell of the greenhouse. The key in my pocket was a small, palpable law. We did return to the public life together, by choice. The next gala we attended as a couple, if such a word can be used without implying ownership, was different from the night when I had first left the ballroom for the rain. We moved through the crowd with people who had known us in different circumstances, old friends, journalists, donors for the foundation. There were cameras, but there was also a kind of permission to be photographed under terms we had set. No staged, invasive shots, no misleading captions. We had negotiated even that boundary. The resulting photograph, the one that made the rounds, showed us framed together but not entangled. A woman in a modest gown, and a man with a quiet jawline, both looking toward the left of the frame rather than directly into the camera. The caption was restrained. It read more like a caption for an institution than a romance. The triangle, public, protector, law, had not disappeared. Instead, it had opened into a longer conversation. Dante continued to honor the limits imposed by his plea. He worked with the foundation, he spoke publicly about the costs of extrajudicial action, and he submitted to audits that would have once read like humiliation for someone who valued privacy as power. He paid fines, he offered restitution, he made the changes that had been negotiated in public and enforced in law. He did not erase his past, he paid for it. Calabresi, constrained by new regulations and a public that was slowly re-educating itself about the mechanics of reputation, receded but did not die. The company changed tactics, fleeting excuses, administrative maneuvers, and new fronts to test the system. The foundation stayed vigilant, offering a practical and legal response. The DA pushed for policy change at the municipal level, and conversations about regulation of reputation markets found their way into committee meetings and city hearings. Change was incremental and often frustrating, but it was real enough to be measured. The last scene that mattered to me was not a headline or a courtroom. It was the small domestic ritual in Dante's kitchen the morning after a foundation launch event. The house had settled into rhythms that felt ordinary without being complacent. Marco had brewed coffee. Rosa had arranged a plate of orange slices like a small offering. Dante asked me simply how I slept. I told him I slept better. The key in my pocket felt like a constant I could touch. We had not solved everything. I still received notes from people who hawked invasions for profit. I still had nights when the sound of a window made me startle and count the ways a wall could be breached. The law had not become a perfect shield. People make choices that are cruel. Institutions change slowly.
But the work we had done, Dante's acceptance of consequence, the foundation's creation, and the DA's involvement had aligned to some of the incentives that had once favored predators. That alignment felt tiring to maintain and necessary to have done. On the roof terrace where I had first decided to continue with him, we stood again, older by months and perhaps a little softer to the world's edges. The city lay like a map full of lives and stories. We looked at each other and agreed on the terms we would continue to live by: the ongoing right to audit, the public charter for restitution, and the insistence that consent be renegotiated and explicit, not assumed.
Our kiss that night was brief, a punctuation that did not promise completion, but rather continued labor. If the love triangle ever had a neat endpoint, it would have been lovely in a novel. In life, triangles reconfigure. The protector had become a partner under law. The law had become a tool of public repair rather than only a cold apparatus, and public life had shifted from a stage for spectacle to a forum for change. My choice to return to the ballroom was not a capitulation to desire, but a reaffirmation of agency. I chose to be seen on terms I helped create. The key, small, metal, and warm when it touched skin, remained in my pocket. It was a token I could flash at myself when doubt crept in, a physical reminder that consent is a process, that protection without accountability is a kind of ownership, and that repair is work that asks for persistence, not fireworks. If this story moved you, watch more tales where danger and longing meet.